Hey, what's up everybody? My name is Calvin B. Fisher. I'm a science fiction author and YouTuber. Recently I've been playing through the Dead Space games and just finished playing the remake, so I've definitely got some thoughts on it. The remake was a lot different than I originally expected. To be honest, I was really excited for the remake, but I was also pretty worried about it. I thought no doubt that the graphics were going to see a huge improvement. I mean, a decade's just going to do that to a game. And I thought the combat was going to feel pretty punchy and weighty, and also see a lot of improvements just due to technology. But I was worried more about the artistic side of things and a lot of the design decisions. I was worried it wouldn't really capture what made Dead Space so special, and that's particularly the dedication to immersion that the original game had. The alarm bells started going off for me when they showed one of the clips in the trailers where the captain is infected by a necromorph. In the original, you retain control of Isaac, being able to move around, check out other things, and at any moment you knew that that necromorph could pop out of that screen and get you. In the remake, however, this had been converted into a cutscene where you're just sitting back as the player watching as Isaac crawls away from the captain. The cutscene is really well made, but it does take that agency away from you. And I watched a developer interview on this, and they said the reason they had made this change was because they were worried that players would miss out on seeing the captain get infected. Which, to be fair, is something that is pretty easy to miss in the original. I, in fact, had missed out on what was happening up until I rewatched the footage I had captured. I was worried this hand-holding mentality and not wanting the player to miss out on things would carry over to the rest of the game. And you'd end up with a game that, while visually immersive, would have kind of a railroady feel to it, where the game was too afraid to let the player discover things for themselves or get immersed too much in the environment before getting torn away by a cutscene. So with these expectations in mind, I had started playing the remake. In fact, I already kind of had an idea of what I would say for this video, up until I realized that my expectations were dead wrong. The remake is just as immersive as the original game. In fact, it might even be more so. And this is one of the best remakes I've played in years, if not ever. So with all that being said, let's get into what's good about the remake and what I thought it did so well. Before we get started, just a heads up that there will be spoilers in this game. I'm not going to be holding anything back, so if you don't want to see footage of the remake and some of the bosses, or hear spoilers about the story, I'd check out, maybe put this video in your watch later list, go play the game and then come back. The remake is one of the most immersive games I've ever played, even surpassing the original in most cases. In one part, this is due to just the technology increases. The visuals are a whole lot better, the sound design has a higher quality, the lighting is immaculate, but all this was to be expected from, again, a game that's a decade newer. What really impressed me were the different design decisions that the team had made making this. Even though there was that cutscene I had mentioned and it worried me, these sections where control is taken away from the player are really minimal. It only happens, I think, a couple handful of times throughout the game. Otherwise, the game really does lean into that immersion while you're playing, and you're in Isaac's shoes most of the time, just taking in the Ishimura and all of the sounds and sights, and seeing just a lot of these both exciting but horrible things transpire. I think a big contributor to this is the interconnectedness of the ship. In the remake, the Ishimura is one big area that you can go back to different areas. For instance, you return to the medical bay multiple times throughout the story. While in the original, each level was a cordoned off section where once you took the train, it was bye-bye and you wouldn't return back. And this interconnectedness, it really makes you intimately familiar with the Ishimura as a setting. Again, as you go to the medical bay multiple times, it really solidifies itself as a place in your head, and I think it greatly contributes to the immersion past the visuals. In addition, there were a lot of improvements to the story and just being able to suck you into it. No, the story wasn't exactly one of my strong points of the first game. Don't get me wrong, the lore is incredible, but the actual story delivered I thought left some things to be desired. The remake has largely the same story, but it greatly improves the execution, which, as a writer myself, I can tell you that execution is pretty much the key to everything. A large part of this is because Isaac was given a voice now when in the original he was silent. It greatly improves immersion, which is surprising because you'd think it would have the opposite effect. If Isaac has a voice, then the player can't imprint themselves as much into him, right? Well, I think it has the opposite effect mainly because of how it affects the other characters. In the original, because Isaac wouldn't speak, you'd have Kendra and you'd have Hammond speaking to Isaac in these long monologues, which just aren't really naturally how humans speak, so they would take you out of the game a little bit each time one of them spoke. In the remake though, because Isaac can speak back, their conversations are a lot more natural. And you aren't really thinking about those metagame type things like how the dialogue is constructed. You're more naturally sucked into the story. I think the character that benefits the most from this is Chalice Mercer, the villain. In the original, he was the definition of a monologuing sort of handball type villain where he would go on and on. Although he still kind of has those same insane, dastardly, religious zealot type vibes, he comes across a lot more naturally here, and he feels more like an actual human being than just a villain in the story, which again I think can be contributed most to dialogue. How we can talk back to him a lot of cases, and it really is more of a two-way conversation, even though Mercer does still monologue quite a bit. So again, those were a lot of improvements to the immersion, which I wasn't expecting, as far as how the game was designed to be even more immersive than the original, past just the technological improvements. So next, let's move on to combat. So I think combat feels great in the remake. There's a really weighty feel to everything, and it captures that visceral nature that the original was known for. Most of the weapons have seen a rework, either their primary or secondary fire mode. For instance, the flamethrower, instead of a secondary blast of fire, has instead a flame wall that you can deploy. It greatly improves a lot of the combat tactics you have available to you. For instance, with the flame wall, if a bunch of necromorphs are charging you, you might think to change your flamethrower and put down a wall to keep them at bay while you switch to a different weapon like maybe the pulse rifle or plasma cutter to cut them down from a distance. Likewise, I think my favorite improvement is to the contact beam. The contact beam now is just a laser that just shreds things. It feels so satisfying to shoot. And the secondary fire is that sort of typical blast you had in the original game. So the weapons themselves, they have the perfect amount of recoil and the perfect feeling of just these powerful tools that Isaac is using that aren't necessarily meant for warfare, but he still finds a way to wield them against the necromorphs and survive. The upgrade system has seen an upgrade. I was not a big fan of the upgrade system in the original game, so to be honest, this was a low bar that the remake had to climb over. The biggest improvement, I think, is getting rid of the blank nodes that the original had. So in the original Dead Space, you had these blank nodes that you had to spend your nodes you collect on, which you'd get nothing in return. It was kind of like ordering a drink from McDonald's and getting back an empty cup. It was just a very unsatisfying, lame feeling. So they got rid of that here, where every time you spend an upgrade node, you actually unlock some benefit, which again is huge to me. In addition, your weapons, besides the node upgrades, you can get upgrade pieces for each weapon, which unlocks even more statistical upgrades available, as well as special upgrades for your weapons that are unique and change behavior. So there's one for the pulse rifle to increase the rate of fire, and one for the flamethrower to increase the length that the flame wall was active. So these changes really did, I think, spice up the upgrade system just enough. It's still not my favorite upgrade system in the world, but I think it's a great improvement over the original. Other mechanics just saw general improvements. For instance, zero gravity is greatly improved. In the original, you would dive at surfaces and it was really bizarre. You were kind of like some sort of space David Hasselhoff just ping-ponging around, which didn't feel great, and the camera would just freak out. The remake solves this by adopting a system similar to Dead Space 2 and 3, where you really can free float in space and hover around and reorient yourself, and it's just a whole lot better of an experience. In the original, I would dread the zero-G sections, but in the remake, I didn't think they were too bad overall, except for one issue I'll get to when I talk about the negatives. The turret sections are a lot better. In the original, they're kind of like a bargain bin asteroid invader game. Here, you still have control of Isaac, but you can shoot the turrets as well, and it greatly improves the second Leviathan boss fight. It made it from, again, a glorified arcade game into a really cool spectacle where you get to utilize Isaac's mechanics as well as the turrets for a really cool boss fight. In addition, the puzzles saw some improvements. A lot of them are the same as the original. They stripped out some of the annoying ones. To be honest, I'm pretty surprised they kept in the infamous asteroid puzzle. I couldn't stand this in the original. There are some improvements to it in the remake where, again, because zero-G works differently, it's just a lot less awkward in general. As well as there's actually hints in the menu where it says activate the interior versus exterior generators, which was a huge help. So I think a lot of attention was paid to those negative aspects of the first game, which again didn't ruin it in any sense of the imagination. Dead Space still is a masterpiece in my eyes, but it took those things and the remake went above and beyond to improve everything. You can tell that this game was made with an act of love by the developers, and this wasn't something that they just phoned in, because they could have gotten away with a lot less, believe me. So now that I've gushed about the game enough, I will get into the bad now, which, don't get me wrong, they're minor things, but to be honest, they did add up over the game's runtime and really aggravate me at times. This list is a lot shorter than my pros, so we won't be here quite as long, but there were a couple things that really nagged at me throughout, and I just wanted to address them. First is that the UI indication was a bit lacking at times, especially when it came to certain enemies. Like the crawlers that lunge at you in 0G, as well as the enemies with the 3-pronged shooters. They were really hard to see, especially in zero gravity. I would spend so much time searching the walls, seeing where I was getting blasted from, and just not being able to make out the enemies. And it was really irritating after a while, especially because some of these zero-G sections are big. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack if that needle is blasting demon darts at you as you were just trying to find it. Overall, that was incredibly aggravating, and it brought down especially the zero-G sections for me. I think overall too, certain things like stasis didn't really have enough of an impact as far as the visuals go. Sometimes it would be hard to tell just from looking alone if I had stasis froze something like doors. There just wasn't much of a visual effect. Another small con for me was how the kinesis ability worked. In the original game, it was a lot more immediate. There was kind of this weird delay, which would throw me off my rhythm. The place that annoyed me the most was, in the original, how I'd break open boxes wasn't stomping. I would actually kinesis pick it up and just chuck it back at the ground. I thought it worked a lot quicker. And because of that brief delay in the kinesis, it kind of threw me off my rhythm when that happened pretty much every time I pick up a box. So maybe that's just a me thing, but it is something that kind of got to me after a little while. I think in addition to those things, probably my biggest criticism was just how the enemies and damage worked. It felt like the enemies were a lot beefier in this game. Like, even at the beginning, I would have to dump almost a half a mag of plasma rounds into them in order to take an enemy down, when it didn't feel like it would take anywhere near that in the original. And in both games, I played at a medium difficulty, so I think it was comparable. Although, again, your mileage might vary based on what difficulty you play on. But in addition to that, the enemies don't really stun lock when you shoot them. In the original, most of the time if you'd shoot at them, especially with things like the flamethrower, it kind of freeze them in place, which made handling them a lot easier. When you take in the remake the increased damage that they can eat, along with that lack of stun effect, it meant that enemies would be charging at you as you'd be blasting into them, and you'd end up just backpedaling through a lot of fights, which again isn't that big of a deal, but it all just felt a little bit off to me. Again, that's just kind of a personal preference. Maybe you won't feel that same way. It was just odd because the weapons feel so weighty and so punchy, yet they wouldn't do that much damage to the necromorphs. It was just kind of odd, but overall I still loved combat, but because of that, I don't know if I loved it quite as much as the original. I'd probably have to go back and replay and see. Again, mileage may vary with difficulty. So yeah, those are just my initial thoughts on the remake. Again, I was just pleasantly surprised by the whole thing. I realized that all of my worries were just unfounded, and overall it is a great game where the developers went above and beyond in almost every way, which in this industry is something that we don't always see. So overall, I definitely recommend checking out the remake, playing it for yourself. It's such a great game to start off the year. With all that said, on this channel I'll be covering Dead Space 3 next, so if that sounds interesting to you, please consider liking and subscribing to see my newest content. I have a feeling my take on Dead Space 3 is going to be a little less popular than this remake, so just stay tuned for that. Hopefully it won't ruffle your feathers all too much. But yeah, that's just all I wanted to go over. Remake was a blast. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a great one. This is Calvin B. Fisher, signing off. Until next time.